selected parts of Rajiv Jhangiani's keynote at OER 21. We invite you to further reflect on the key issues addressed and think about your everyday practice with a critical approach. Keeping our attention high on the risks of open washing is extremely important for us as a community, even more so if we advocate for more open education as the default approach for the benefits of society at large. What does it mean to be open?
In case you're not familiar with Sarah Lambert's exceptional scholarship, I really want to recommend that you read her 2018 article in the Journal of Learning for Development. In it, she shows how the open education literature is aligned to social justice principles, right from the first UNESCO definition of OER. But she also shows that the principles of social justice somehow became lost along the way, being either hidden or weakly implied or simply absent in most of the influential texts that have shaped the modern open education period. Of course, Sarah doesn't just highlight the issues, she also proposes the following definition. Open education, she writes, is the development of free, digitally enabled learning materials and experiences primarily by and for the benefit and empowerment of non-privileged learners who may be underrepresented in education systems or marginalized in their global context. She goes on, success of social justice aligned programs can be measured not by any particular technical feature or format, but instead by the extent to which they enact redistributive justice, recognitive justice, and/or representational justice. Now, redistributive justice involves the allocation of material or human resources towards those who by circumstance have less. Recognitive justice involves the recognition and respect for cultural and gender difference, and representational justice involves equitable representation and political voice. Sarah writes, providing a free textbook to learners of color in the American two-year college system is redistributive justice in action. It reduces the costs, it increases the chances of success for learners who by circumstance have less. They are marginalized in education, workplaces, and more broadly in society. But how open, she writes, is the textbook for marginalized learners if Indigenous, Hispanic, and learners of color are invisible inside the textbook, and perhaps invisible in the whole curriculum? The editing of such a textbook to include images and cases featuring more diverse communities, businesses, and people would be an act of recognitive justice. But what if the textbook features people of color, but does not value their perspectives, knowledges, or histories? What if the textbook takes a white colonial view of Black lives? If Black stories are told solely by white voices? The development or selection of a new version of a textbook, or perhaps a new resource altogether, written by people of color, where they are free to represent their own views, histories, and knowledges, now that would be an act of representational justice, to give voice to those who are often not heard. Who gets to decide what is open enough? Even if we focus on simply the question of open licensing for a moment, I think this is a complicated question. Open licensing is many things. It's a legal mechanism to increase access and amplify impact. It's an invitation to collaboration and derivation. It's a key that unlocks new pedagogical possibilities. But I've also seen it used as a stick to beat people over the head with, and a litmus test for purity. We know, for example, that there are 6 possible Creative Commons licenses to choose from, depending on what particular combination of attribution share, like non-commercial or no derivatives, is included. And of course, I'm not talking about the public domain dedication tool here. We know that these 6 licenses vary in their degree of openness, as illustrated over here. We also know that the 2 licenses that include the no derivatives clause do not permit the revision and remix of a given resource, which effectively disqualifies it from being considered OER. So we have 6 licenses, but really only 4 that most folks in the field point people to, right? Fair. But even then, I sometimes, honestly, I see rude gestures, shall I say, made in the direction of the non-commercial or the share-alike licenses. CC BY is really the way to go, is the implicit and sometimes the explicit message. And now, of course, I understand why CC BY is powerful, why it is encouraged as the default license, but I also think we need to be open to the whole spectrum. I would hate for the message to new practitioners to be that, yes, there are 6 licenses, but really only 4. And even then, we will judge you if you use any of these 3. I never wish to narrow the door through which we can invite people in. Not every educator wishes to, needs to, or has the bandwidth to revise or remix a resource. And sometimes the decision, is not even left to individual educators, as some repositories refuse to include resources that include some of the more restrictive permissions, which I think means that the option to adopt that resource is either being taken away from them or at least obscured through making that resource less discoverable. These are decisions, design decisions. I can also tell you that if you are working with colleagues who are interested in creating or adapting OER, it is helpful to widen that doorway too. I've seen enough open textbook authors who begin with a more restrictive license, later choose to republish their work under a more open license, to believe that presenting the full continuum of open licenses is a pragmatic approach, but that also respects the agency of authors.
That's exactly the path we took with our MOOCs and other OER we developed. We started choosing the CC BY and CSA license and then explored more permissive licenses when we could, which means when we were more confident with remixing resources and when it was doable from a legal perspective and consistent with the content experts involved. We did not end up with CC BY only OER. We continue to use different licenses according to the specific context and their limitations or needs. Sometimes, narrower licenses make it more comfortable for newcomers to join the movement with a small steps tactic.
This is precisely why we see so many adopt a non-commercial license. The notion of the irrevocability of an open license can be scary to newcomers. It's important to acknowledge that. And most educators, I think, wish for non-privileged learners to benefit from their work, and that includes facilitating the reuse and revision of their work by fellow educators. But they do not wish for their intellectual labor, gifted freely to the world, to be monetized by commercial textbook vendors. Interestingly, this exact same fear sometimes leads people to select a share-alike license. The thinking here is that because any revision to their work or any remix of their work would have to be published under an identical license, they believe that this would serve as an effective deterrent against commercial vendors ever touching their work. Now, as a psychologist, this is fascinating to me because this illustrates how different motivations can sometimes lead to the same choice of license. It also shows how a choice to remain a little closed can sometimes actually be a defensive move in an exploitative world. The psychology of open licenses is, I think, interesting because it comes with its own set of unwritten rules or injunctive norms, as we would say. On the one hand, as I've said, there is the provision of 6 licenses with the implicit discouragement of many of them. And on the other hand, there's the provision of the CC0 public dedication tool that does not require attribution, but with the implicit encouragement to provide attribution. And in some ways, this, I have to say, this reminds me of cricket. It's a sport I adore, but it has many examples of actions that are technically permitted, but implicitly discouraged. If you follow the game, you'll know that running out the non-striker who is backing up too much is one example of a behavior that is held up as within the rules, but against the spirit of cricket. And just as the spirit of cricket provides the context and culture for that sport, it is the values, I think, of open education that provide the context and culture for open licensing. The final thing I will say about licensing is this: you really cannot judge a creator by their license. And I think shaming or coercing people into greater openness is hardly in keeping with the values of open education. If we're serious about respecting the agency of authors and creators, I think we need to respect people's choice of license. I'm not sure we can subjugate agency to openness and still describe our approach as open.
Openness without respect for agency can do real harm.
Is being open always a good thing? Now, don't get me wrong, I very much believe in the potential of open education to be a force for good. But I think it is important to remind ourselves that not everything can be open, nor should it be open.
Example 1. There is a real risk of meaningful content being transformed with a different and potentially disrespectful meaning. We all know that online platforms provide plenty of tools to modify any content in any format into something different. The aim and the values that influence these choices can vary widely. By choosing a license that discourages such behavior in sensitive contexts, we can be more respectful by providing information through our chosen license. Going for a no-derivative license, for example, gives a clear indication related to the author's will to respect the content and the people behind it. How can being open also be closed?
This one may come a little quicker, because I think we often talk about the importance of things like technical openness, including, for example, providing editable files when you publish OER, so that you're not just legally permitting, but you're also technically facilitating the revision and remixing of your work. But a lack of technical openness is only one way in which one can engage in open education while still being somewhat closed. Consider, for example, if we create and share videos that are not captioned, images that do not include alt text, or if we use color schemes for graphs that are indistinguishable for those who have color blindness. Or if we assume that everyone has reliable internet access, and so we do not make OER downloadable or available offline. Or if we publish OER, but we participate in active data extraction from users by requiring account creation or tracking users' behaviors through invasive data analytics. But when we work within systems and norms, I think that uphold exclusion at every turn, it is incredibly easy to engage in openness on the surface and in content while working against it in structure and process. It's like saying that everyone is welcome to use the sidewalk, but not bothering to design or install curb cuts or curb ramps. Or worse still, saying that everyone is welcome to use public benches, but in fact deliberately adopting a hostile design that prevents the homeless from sleeping on them. And for those who think that, we just keep raising the bar when it comes to OER, that, gosh, now you're saying it needs to be technically open. Oh, it needs to be accessible. All right, it needs to be downloadable. Oh, goodness, and it needs to respect data privacy too. My goodness. I'm going to suggest that the degree of discomfort you're experiencing is likely as a symptom of the privilege you're enjoying. If you do not use a wheelchair, then you may not wonder about why curb cuts are essential. But of course, as with curb cuts, when we make our systems more inclusive, it benefits everyone, whether it's parents pushing strollers or teenagers on skateboards. Now, of course, one other unfortunate feature of the status quo in open education is our over-reliance on voluntary and uncompensated labor, or at least severely undercompensated labor. Now, as I've written, I believe that this perpetuates an implicit form of redlining, one that reserves the capacity to create or adapt OER for those who already enjoy positions of privilege, such as the tenured or those who can afford to forego the extra income. And as a result, what we're really doing is, despite the best of intentions, the ideologies, biases, prejudices associated with those positions of privilege inadvertently become reflected and overrepresented in the available OER. This goes back to what Sarah Lambert wrote about in terms of recognitive and representational justice. Undercompensation does perpetuate and exacerbate this.
How can being closed also be open?
And I think this is a trickier question because certainly many of us are big believers in open ed practices, but also open ed tech infrastructure. But I do think about cases where agency comes up against openness. Whether this agency is exercised by creators applying a share alike or a no derivatives license, Indigenous communities asserting that certain traditional knowledge is not meant for public consumption, students engaging in open pedagogy projects but choosing to not openly license their work, or disallowing digital annotations on one's own domain. Agency, in my view, is a key and critical value of open education.
If open is the means, then what is the end?
Open for me is the means to an end. And I'm not sure what you think the end should be. When I think about the end that open serves, to me, this resembles the values that Sarah Lambert wrote about. Despite the best of intentions, open educational practices may be neutral or even negative, such as, for example, if it's done without student agency or choice to opt out of public scholarship, if it reproduces hegemonic knowledge, or if students are, let's say, not appropriately informed or equipped on how to engage in open practice and its risks, such as when you have marginalized students who are targeted and harassed as part of online open scholarship. Open educational practices can certainly be ameliorative if they address, let's say, economic injustice by producing resources and scholarship that become accessible to populations who would not otherwise be able to afford access. But practices like this can either be instructor-centered or learner-centered. They can be content-centric or process-centric, and primarily pedagogical or primarily social justice focused. And these are the lines along which we will see the difference between open educational practices that are ameliorative and those that are truly transformative. In the latter case, it's marginalized groups that are involved in the design of the content and processes, and both epistemologies and structural academic gatekeeping may be challenged. This once again connects with the notion of representational justice that Sarah Lambert wrote about. To go back to the image that was on my title slide, and thank you, Brian Mathers, for your wonderful work and allowing me to do a bit of a meta remix over here. This, I think, is what I've been wondering about out loud today. I know that openness can be leveraged for justice, clearly, particularly if we go beyond ameliorative uses to more transformative uses, and if we go beyond redistributive justice to recognitive and especially representational justice. And as Maha and Mia described, justice can be served when one works to address systemic equity issues while also embodying care in how we do this. But of course, openness may also do harm. On the other hand, closed practices can certainly do harm, but we also see cases of where being closed is actually a more just choice. Ultimately, I suspect that choice itself is the key word over here, as without the agency, we are stripped of the power to toggle either of these buttons, to set the menu instead of being fed crumbs of compassion, to be welcomed instead of merely being included, and to serve justice instead of merely being open. I will leave you with the words, the powerful words, once again, of Arundhati Roy. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing.
The keynote ended with a provocative last question. Will the uncomfortable questions ever end? The answer is no. We need to continue being ready to ask ourselves critical questions to make our work meaningful, especially if we are keen to work to really open up education. So let's start here. Who can really benefit from open education? Nothing is the creation of a single person. Every resource is an explicit or implicit collection of insights and experiences by a multitude of people and generations.